August 25, 1944. The wind coming off the channel carried the smell of fuel and seaweed across Cherbourg Harbor in northern France. Sergeant William Henderson wiped a line of grease from his forearm and froze, wrench in hand, as he stared at the impossible sight forming across the fields. Convoy after convoy, thousands of trucks, stretched beyond the horizon like an iron river. Engines coughed, exhaust pipes rattled, and drivers shouted orders over the growing thunder of machinery. Just weeks before, officers had sworn these trucks wouldn't last a month in real combat. The British claimed they were underpowered junk, farm equipment pretending to be military vehicles. But now, nearly 6,000 of them were lining up, ready to carry the fate of an entire army on their steel beds. 3 simple letters were stamped on each curved hood: GMC. To the engineers back in America, it stood for General Motors Corporation. But to the exhausted U.S. soldiers climbing into the driver's seats, 3 out of every 4 of them African American, those letters meant something else entirely. They meant hope. They meant momentum. They meant survival. None of those men knew it yet, but the same truck dismissed just 4 years earlier as a worthless design was about to become the most important vehicle in the European war. More vital than tanks, more reliable than aircraft, more decisive than any weapon fired in anger. This wasn't a story about glory. It wasn't about heroes charging into battle. This was the story of a truck, the GMC CCKW, known simply as the Jimmy, and how it became the backbone of a desperate supply lifeline that would come to be known as the Red Ball Express. The road to the Red Ball Express didn't begin on the battlefields of Europe. It began in 1939, far from any front line, in a quiet General Motors engineering building in Pontiac, Michigan. There, inside a design workshop scattered with blueprints and coffee-stained drafting tables, a team of civilian engineers received a challenge from the United States Army Ordnance Corps. The Army wanted something that didn't yet exist, a medium-duty military transport truck that could survive mud, frost, rain, and war. Their specifications sounded straightforward: carry 2.5 tons of cargo, drive with 6 powered wheels, operate in any terrain, any season, be rugged enough for war, but still cheap enough to build by the tens of thousands. Designing a truck was easy. Designing a truck that could be mass-produced for global war, decades before computers or robotics, was something else entirely. General Motors took a bold approach. Rather than design some futuristic armored machine, they started with something familiar, a commercial work truck, then reshaped it into a military tool. They modified their civilian AX truck chassis, added another driven axle for traction, reinforced the steel frame, and installed all-wheel drive. The result was a prototype called the ACKWX353, a rough draft of what would later evolve into the legendary CCKW. Under the hood sat a modest GMC 248 cubic inch straight 6 engine. It didn't roar, it hummed, just 77 horsepower pushing nearly 5 tons of steel. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't elegant, and early on, not everyone believed in it. But history has a strange way of turning humble machines into legends. Before the CCKW became a legend, its early ancestor nearly killed the entire program. In late 1939, with Europe already at war, France placed an order for 1,000 of GM's new experimental 6x6 trucks, hoping they would modernize their aging transport fleet. Production began quietly at Yellow Truck and Coach, a General Motors subsidiary. The trucks rolled out with closed steel cabs, wooden troop benches, and boxy cargo beds. They looked more like construction vehicles than tools of war. Then the world changed overnight. In May 1940, German panzers crashed through the Ardennes forest and shattered France in just 6 weeks. The speed of the blitzkrieg stunned the world. The French army collapsed. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped at Dunkirk. And those new American trucks, nearly 2,000 were captured by the Germans, who, ironically, then used them on the Eastern Front and praised their reliability. The remaining batch of trucks, now orphaned by France's fall, was rerouted to Britain under emergency contracts, but the British Army was not impressed. They tested the trucks and tore them apart in their reports. Wheelbase too long for European roads, underpowered engine, struggles in mud despite 6-wheel drive, poor hill climbing ability, unfit for combat conditions. Their verdict was harsh, unsuitable for modern war. Most of the trucks were quietly shipped off to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, where they disappeared into the frozen mud of the Eastern Front. The message from the British was clear. American trucks were too soft for European war. It sounded like the end of the road. But back in Michigan, the engineers at General Motors didn't get discouraged. They got angry. Instead of abandoning the project, they tore into every criticism and used it as fuel. The truck didn't need to be pretty. It didn't need luxury engineering. What it needed was more power, a stronger frame, interchangeable parts, simpler field repairs, versions for every military role. And above all, it had to be mass-produced faster than war could destroy it. The British thought they had judged that first truck correctly. They had no idea what was coming next. War has a way of forcing evolution, and by 1941, General Motors was ready to prove the British wrong. The engineers returned to the drawing board, not to chase perfection, but to build something that could survive war, factory floors, and frozen foxholes alike. The result was the GMC CKW. Even its name reflected no-nonsense military logic. C, designed in 1941. C, conventional cab. K, all-wheel drive. W, dual rear axles. It wasn't revolutionary. It didn't look like a weapon that would win a world war. But piece by piece, the truck became something soldiers could depend on. Smarter, stronger, still simple. The upgraded 270 cubic inch inline-six engine replaced the earlier 248. Power jumped to 104 horsepower, a small boost that made a huge difference under load. Two wheelbase versions allowed specialized roles. CCKW 352, short frame artillery hauler. CCKW 353, long frame cargo hauler, the most common. A rugged ladder steel frame and riveted crossmembers made field repairs easy. Vacuum-assisted hydraulic brakes improved stopping power. 6x6 drive with 3 powered axles gave it real off-road ability. This time, GM didn't just build a truck. It built a system, a standardized vehicle with interchangeable parts so it could be repaired almost anywhere by anyone. Built for war, built for mass production. By 1943, production was exploding. Instead of being handcrafted like British military vehicles, CCKWs were mass-produced on roaring American assembly lines. They were easy to build, easy to repair, and hard to kill. Steel shortages during the war forced redesigns. The heavy steel cab was replaced with a canvas top open cab, lighter and faster to build. The cargo bed evolved from steel to wood to a simple steel design, again to reduce failures. Every decision made the truck tougher, cheaper, and more available. And that's what mattered. Quantity was a weapon, and America was about to unleash it. At the height of production, one CCKW rolled off the line every 7 minutes. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. 2 factories produced more trucks than Germany built of all kinds during the entire war. This was more than engineering. This was industrial warfare. And soon, this ugly, unstoppable iron workhorse would meet its purpose on the battlefields of France. On June 6, 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy and cracked open Hitler's fortress in Europe. The world remembers the heroism of Omaha Beach, the paratroopers at Sainte-Mère-Église, and the burning wrecks along the coast. But what came next nearly destroyed the invasion. By July, over 1 million Allied soldiers were packed into a tiny patch of Normandy countryside. They weren't advancing, they were stuck. Germany had turned the French farmlands into a maze of hedgerows that swallowed tanks, trapped infantry, and slowed progress to a crawl. Then came the breakout. Operation Cobra shattered German lines in late July. Suddenly, Patton's Third Army burst through and started racing across France faster than any logistics officer thought possible. 50, 60, even 80 miles a day. The advance was electrifying. It also created a nightmare. The tanks weren't being stopped by the Germans. They were being stopped by empty fuel tanks. Each Sherman tank guzzled 150 gallons of fuel every 100 miles. Patton alone needed 400,000 gallons of fuel every single day. The entire Allied front needed over 3 million gallons daily. And that fuel had to travel over 300 miles from the beaches to the front lines over bombed-out French roads with no working rail system. Why no trains? Because the Allies had destroyed them, on purpose. In the months before D-Day, Allied bombers obliterated every major rail line in northern France to stop German reinforcements. It worked brilliantly until the Allies themselves needed those railroads to move supplies. To make matters worse, the American artificial harbor at Omaha Beach was destroyed by a storm. Cherbourg's port was captured, but demolished by retreating Germans. The port of Antwerp, vital to logistics, was still in German hands.
By late August, disaster loomed. Ammunition was rationed. Fuel was nearly gone. Patton's advance, the fastest in history, was about to die in an empty fuel can, unless someone could perform a miracle. In late August 1944, with fuel running out and the front on the brink of collapse, American logistics officers gathered in a chaotic planning room in Normandy. Maps covered the walls, coffee cups stacked like sandbags. Radios crackled nonstop with bad news. They had 36 hours to solve a crisis no army had ever faced before: how to feed fuel and ammunition to an army moving faster than its own supply lines. The solution they came up with was insane. If trains were gone and pipelines weren't built yet, they would use trucks, thousands of trucks. They would turn the roads of France into rolling supply arteries that never stopped moving. Not for weather, not for repairs, not for the enemy. They called it a one-way superhighway of war. The rules of the operation. A daring plan took shape. Convoys would run 24/7, day and night. Only military vehicles allowed on the route. No stopping, ever. No lights at night. Blackout conditions. Every intersection guarded by military police. Loaded trucks would go one way, empty trucks return the other way. To mark the priority route, bright red circles were painted on road signs and truck hoods. The railroad term for priority freight gave the operation its name, the Red Ball Express. They took every truck they had. There weren't enough trucks in any one unit, so commanders stripped vehicles from everywhere. Artillery units gave up haulers. Engineer battalions gave up dump trucks. Medics gave up ambulances. Infantry divisions lost their transports. If it had wheels and an engine, it was taken. And above all, they took CCKWs, thousands of them. They poured into fields outside Cherbourg and Saint-Lô until a steel ocean of GMC 2.5-ton trucks stretched to the horizon. But trucks alone weren't enough. They needed drivers. And that's when the U.S. Army did something it had resisted from the beginning of the war. It turned to the only soldiers with enough numbers, experience, and will to take on this mission. The U.S. Army in 1944 was still segregated. Black soldiers fought for a country that didn't give them equal rights, equal pay, or in many cases, even respect. They were often kept out of combat roles, pushed instead into labor battalions, dock companies, and supply units. But when the Red Ball Express was created, America needed drivers, thousands of them, fast. And that meant turning to the men who had been there all along, working in silence, loading ships and hauling gear since D-Day, African-American soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps. Out of 23,000 drivers and mechanics assigned to the Red Ball Express, 75% were African-American. These men didn't volunteer because it was glorious. They volunteered because the front line depended on them. Who were they? Sharecroppers' sons from Mississippi who had driven tractors but never trucks. Steel workers from Pittsburgh used to long hours and hard labor. Bus drivers from New York. Dock workers from New Orleans. Students from Chicago. Men who had grown up under Jim Crow segregation, facing racism their entire lives, and who now fought to prove they were every bit as capable as any soldier in uniform. Most had never driven long-haul trucks before. Some had never driven a vehicle at all before the Army. Their training? Maybe a few days at most. Then they were handed the wheel of a CCKW loaded with 5 tons of gasoline or ammunition and told, "Get it to the front. Don't stop for anything." They didn't ask for medals. They didn't ask for recognition. They asked for one thing only, a chance to serve. Men like Private James Ruckert, who would later say, "We knew they needed us. Without us, Patton stopped, and Patton never stopped." The Red Ball was more than a convoy. It was a road where black soldiers proved their courage, mile after mile, long before America was willing to admit it. The orders were simple: keep them rolling. Doing it was anything but. Every Red Ball Express run was a gamble against exhaustion, weather, and death. Convoys rolled out of Normandy, packed with fuel, ammo, food, medical supplies, everything an army needs to survive. Their destination, frontline depots that move farther east every single day. The convoy rules. Officially, the Red Ball system had rules. Minimum 5 trucks per convoy, Jeep escorts front and rear, 25 miles per hour speed limit, 60-yard spacing, no lights at night. In reality, those rules blew away with the first convoy. Drivers ran alone or in pairs if needed. The speed limit turned into go as fast as the truck will go. Some drivers ripped out the engine governors and pushed their trucks past 60 miles per hour, bouncing over broken French roads in the dark, praying the brakes would hold. Night runs were the worst. Headlights were banned to avoid German air attacks, so trucks used tiny blackout slit lamps called cat eyes that barely glowed. Most of the time, drivers couldn't see the road at all. They followed the faint shadow of the truck ahead, or nothing at all. Many described driving by feel, memorizing every bend and hill from countless trips. One wrong turn, and you were lost, or worse, in enemy territory. Real dangers on the road. Red Ball drivers faced. German fighters strafing runs, snipers along tree lines, hidden landmines and booby traps, ambushes from isolated German units, French roads cratered by artillery, bridges that barely held together, and most of all, fatigue. Drivers routinely ran 60 to 80 hours with almost no sleep. Coffee became survival. Cigarettes kept hands moving. Some took Benzedrine pills, military-issued amphetamines meant to fight fatigue, but known to cause hallucinations and deadly mistakes. You'd see trucks drifting off the road, one driver recalled. Guys would fall asleep with their eyes open. Maintenance? Forget it. There was no time for proper repairs. Mechanics became legends, fixing trucks in mud pits, in fields, under fire, armed with little more than a wrench and pure stubbornness. If a truck died, another wasn't sent to replace it. The driver grabbed tools and brought that truck back to life, or he hitched a ride on the next convoy. Trucks were cannibalized on the roadside, parts ripped from disabled rigs to revive others. It was chaos. It was dangerous, and it worked. The Red Ball wasn't neat, it wasn't safe, but it kept the front alive, mile after mile, gallon after gallon, bullet after bullet. Within just 5 days of launching, the Red Ball Express became a monster, an unstoppable supply engine roaring across France. On August 29, 1944, it hit full power, 132 truck companies, 5,958 vehicles on the road, over 12,000 tons of supplies delivered in one day. No one, not even the generals who designed it, believed that number was possible. But the Red Ball didn't care what was possible. It cared about momentum, the supply machine that never slept. Every minute of every day, 900 trucks were moving, always. ACCKW left Normandy every 90 seconds. Convoys stretched hundreds of miles, bumper to bumper. Depots operated by lantern light. Loading trucks in under 10 minutes. 5-ton loads went in. 5-ton loads went out. No excuses, no delays, no mercy. By the time the operation ended, 412,193 tons of supplies had been delivered. 121 million ton miles driven. 82 days of nonstop trucking, 6,000 trucks at peak operation. Nothing like it had been seen before. Nothing like it has happened since. Stories from the road. Private James Rucard of the 514th Quartermaster Regiment later recalled, "We hauled anything Patton needed, gasoline, ammo, K-rations, you name it. Drive to the front, turn around, do it again. The engine would burn your legs through the floorboard sometimes. You were scared, but you kept going, and they kept going through. Minefields, sniper fire, fog so thick, drivers tied ropes between trucks to stay together, engines so hot, radiators boiled over. The truth about the Jimmy, drivers cursed the CCKW daily, the brakes squealed, the transmissions jammed, the canvas tops leaked, the clutch pedal fought back like a mule. But when it counted, the Jimmy always started. You could drive it half broken. You could overheat it. You could blow a tire, crack the engine block, rip off a fender, and it would still drag itself forward like a wounded animal refusing to die. Mechanics loved it. Drivers trusted it. The war depended on it.
The Red Ball Express was a miracle of logistics, but it was also a mirror of America in 1944, and that meant it was segregated. African American drivers made up 3 out of every 4 men on the Red Ball, but they didn't get equal treatment, not in pay, not in equipment, not even in the chow line. They drove the same deadly roads, faced the same air attacks, hauled the same explosive cargo, but many were still forced to eat in separate mess tents, sleep in separate camps, and even wait until white units were served first. You accepted discrimination, recalled Corporal Washington Rucker of the 3916. We were warned not to socialize with whites. Some didn't want us passing their convoys. But when shells started falling, race didn't matter. Surviving did tension on the highway. Not every white driver accepted them. Some tried to block black drivers from passing, risking collisions, refused to help change tires or tow broken trucks, cut them off intentionally on mountain roads. But the front had a way of stripping away ignorance. While some clung to hate, others woke up to reality. Those black drivers were saving their lives. White infantrymen cheered when the Red Ball arrived. Tank crews waved them in like heroes. Combat troops didn't care who was bringing fuel, as long as someone did. Most white soldiers respected us, Rucker said. They knew without us, they had no bullets, no food, no nothing brotherhood in the chaos. On the road, unofficial rules took over. If a truck broke down, any driver, black or white, stopped to help. If someone fell asleep at the wheel, the next truck banged his tailgate to wake him up. If the Luftwaffe attacked, nobody drove alone. Under fire, there were no colors, just drivers. The U.S. Army didn't award them medals. The newspapers didn't print their names. But every time a convoy made it to the front, these men, treated as second-class citizens in their own country, proved something the world couldn't ignore. Courage has no skin color. Generals are remembered for battles, but wars are won by supply. And the commanders who led the Allied armies knew exactly who kept them alive, the drivers of the Red Ball Express. Patton knew the truth. General George S. Patton, famous for slapping soldiers and charging tanks across Europe, wasn't easy to impress, but he worshipped fuel more than firepower. "My men can eat their belts if they have to," he once said, "but my tanks have got to have gas." And day after day, it was the Red Ball that brought it to him. Patton later admitted, "The 2.5-ton truck is our most valuable weapon. Not the Sherman tank, not artillery, not aircraft, a truck, because he knew, without supply, there is no war." Eisenhower gave them credit. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, didn't hand out compliments lightly. But in October 1944, he sent a message directly to the men of the Red Ball. "To you drivers, mechanics, and officers who keep the Red Ball vehicles moving, I give my deepest appreciation. You are doing an excellent job." He understood something most civilians never would. Battles are fought by soldiers, but they are won by logistics. Logistics broke the Nazi war machine. The Red Ball Express didn't just supply Patton, it crushed the German army with movement. While German divisions starved for fuel and ammunition, American forces got stronger every mile they advanced. German prisoners later told interrogators, "We knew we had lost when we saw your supply lines." The Red Ball became a symbol, not of glory, but of relentless momentum. An army in motion, a machine that could not be stopped. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a victory for the Allies. It was a death sentence for the German army. The truth is brutal. Germany didn't lose the war because of inferior soldiers or tanks. Germany lost because it ran out of gas, the myth of German efficiency. German propaganda sold the world the image of a perfectly engineered war machine, sleek panzers, mobile infantry, precise offensives. But behind the front lines was a truth they tried to hide. The German army relied on horses, millions of them. Most German divisions had almost no trucks. Fuel shortages crippled every German offensive. It sounds unbelievable, but it's true. Over 2.7 million horses pulled German supply wagons during World War II. While American drivers pushed CCKWs across France, German soldiers slogged through mud beside wagons that looked like they came from World War I, crushed by logistics. German supply lines were strangled by fuel starvation. No oil meant no panzers. Allied air power, German trucks moved only at night or died flaming on the road. Sabotage by the French resistance, bridges blown, rails cut, convoys ambushed. Too few trucks. Germany built only 100,000 trucks during the entire war. America built over 500,000 CCKWs alone. Captured German officers admitted the truth. Your weapons are not as good as ours, but you always have them, and we do not. Logistics wins wars. While the Wehrmacht stalled, the Red Ball Express turned supply into strategy. Fuel became a weapon. Speed became artillery. Movement crushed resistance faster than any tank assault. A German soldier summed up the fear. "We were not defeated by your guns. We were defeated by your trucks." By November 1944, the thunder of the Red Ball Express had begun to fade. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well. The Allies finally captured Antwerp, the deep-water port they had desperately needed since D-Day. Once engineers cleared mines and repaired docks, ships could unload supplies far closer to the front. Meanwhile, Allied railway units worked overtime, restoring destroyed French rail lines. Pipelines snaked their way across Europe, pumping fuel straight to forward depots. For the first time since D-Day, the supply crisis eased. After 82 days of nonstop operation, the U.S. Army finally sent the order. Red Ball Express shutting down. On November 16, 1944, the last of the big convoys rolled off the road. Drivers who hadn't slept more than a few hours a night in months finally shut down their engines. Some collapsed in their seats. Mechanics dropped wrenches and walked away after working around the clock with no rotation. 23,000 men had kept the Lifeline alive. They didn't receive medals. They didn't get a parade. Most didn't even get a thank you. But the record spoke for itself. 412,000 tons of supplies delivered, 6,000 trucks operating at peak, 900-plus vehicles on the road at any one time, 121 million miles driven, 75% of drivers African American. The Red Ball had done the impossible. It kept the Allied armies moving at the moment they were closest to collapse. It turned the tide of the war without firing a shot. But the story wasn't over yet. Because just a few weeks later, Hitler made his last move, and the trucks were called back to war. When people talk about World War II, they talk about tanks, planes, and battles. But ask any veteran who served in Europe, and they'll tell you a different truth. The war was won by a truck. The GMC CCKW, the Jimmy, the 2.5-ton 6x6, became the backbone of Allied power. It didn't roar like a tank or soar like a Spitfire. It didn't look heroic. But it did the one thing that mattered most in war. It moved. It moved artillery. It moved rations. It moved medicine, spare parts, ammo, and hope. It moved an army across a continent. Why it succeeded while others failed. The CCKW wasn't pretty, but it was perfect for war. Simple engine. Soldiers could fix it with a wrench and grit. Interchangeable parts. Mechanics could rebuild one truck from 3 broken ones. 6-wheel drive. Mud, ice, snow, mountains. It didn't care. Mass-produced. More than 500,000 built. Enough to outrun destruction. Hard to kill. Cracked frames, shot-up radiators, bullet holes, still rolled. One crew told of running a CCKW with no brakes for 40 miles. Another with a cracked engine block held together with wire. Drivers swore the truck had a soul. Mechanics treated them like stubborn mules. Difficult, loud, but loyal until the end. Even General Patton, who hated excuses, said, "The 2.5-ton truck is our most valuable weapon, not a tank, not a general, a truck. Because without trucks, armies become refugees. Without fuel, tanks become scrap. Without ammo, soldiers die." The CCKW didn't just support the Red Ball Express. It made the Red Ball Express possible. It kept the war moving. It made victory possible. And its story still wasn't finished.
Just when the Red Ball Express shut down and drivers thought the worst was behind them, Hitler struck back. In December 1944, German forces launched a surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, smashing into a thin American line in Belgium and Luxembourg. It became the last great German offensive of the war, and the largest battle the U.S. Army would ever fight. The world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. The weather was brutal. Ice storms froze rifles solid, temperatures plunged, snow buried artillery positions, fog made air support impossible. American units were surrounded, cut off, and running out of everything. Once again, the U.S. Army faced disaster, and once again, the answer came on 6 wheels. The red ball rises again. With railroads cut, fuel depots destroyed, and roads clogged with retreating units, High Command knew there was only one way to rush reinforcements and supplies to the front, bring back the convoys. It didn't matter that the Red Ball Express had officially ended. The trucks were still there, the drivers were still there, and they knew what had to be done. The operation returned under new emergency supply routes. The Little Red Ball, the White Ball Express, the XYZ convoys, the names changed. But the mission didn't. Keep the front alive. Worse than before. If Normandy was brutal, the Ardennes was hell. Trucks skidded over ice cliffs, engines froze and had to be lit on fire underneath to thaw. Drivers used rags and newspapers to block freezing wind in the open cabs. Black ice, landmines, and sniper fire haunted every mile. German paratroopers disguised as USMPS tried to misdirect convoys into ambushes. Still, the trucks rolled. Cold? You couldn't feel your hands on the wheel, one driver recalled, but those boys in Bastogne needed ammo, so we drove, and once again, the GMCC CKW, that ugly, stubborn, rattling beast, became the lifeline of an army. Germany surrendered in May 1945, and the world tried to catch its breath. But war leaves behind survivors and machines, and both have stories long after the guns go silent. The GMC-CKW had survived everything Europe threw at it: artillery blasts, frozen mountains, overloading, neglect, even sabotage. And after the war, it just kept going. The Jimmy becomes a world citizen. When peace returned, the CCKW didn't retire. It spread across the world. The U.S. Army still had hundreds of thousands of them. They were shipped to France, Britain, Belgium, and Norway. Thousands went to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. After the war, Italy, Greece, Israel, Brazil, Argentina, South Korea, and dozens more nations bought them as surplus. The truck built to win a war became the truck that helped rebuild the world. Decades of service. The Jimmy served in the Korean War, on U.S. military bases into the late 1950s, in National Guard units into the 1960s, in foreign armies into the 1970s and 1980s, and even today, some still run in small towns, fire departments, and logging camps. Why did it last so long? Because it was built on 3 simple truths: easy to fix, hard to kill, impossible to replace, until something better came along. Eventually, its successor, the M35 Deuce and a Half, took its place. But the M35 didn't erase the Jimmy. It honored it. Every military truck built since carries the DNA of the CCKW. It wasn't just a truck anymore. It was an idea. Build something simple. Build it strong. Build it so a soldier can fix it with a wrench in the rain and keep going. The convoys stopped, the engines went quiet, the drivers went home, but for many of the men of the Red Ball Express, especially the black soldiers who made up 75% of its drivers, their battle wasn't over. They had survived enemy fire, sleepless nights, deadly roads, burning engines, and now they returned to a country still chained to segregation. No victory parade waited for them, no medals, no fame. Few even knew their names. After risking their lives to fuel freedom in Europe, they returned to whites-only buses and lunch counters, banks that refused them, GI Bill home loans, universities that turned them away, jobs that would not hire them. America was proud of winning the war, but it wasn't ready to face the truth that thousands of those victories had been made possible by African-American men it still treated as second-class citizens. Hollywood erases history. In 1952, Universal Pictures made a film called The Red Ball Express. It told the story of the operation, but the truth was erased. At the request of the U.S. Department of Defense, the studio downplayed the role of black drivers and pretended the convoys were racially integrated. The men who had kept Patton moving, the men who sacrificed sleep, safety, comfort, and sometimes their lives, were written out of their own story, but they remembered. The truth finally emerges. Starting in the 1980s and 1990s, historians began tracking down surviving drivers. Their voices, long ignored, finally began to be heard. James Ruckert, a 514th driver, told a reporter, "We were young, we were scared, but we did what had to be done." Another driver said, "Every load delivered, every mile, that was us proving we deserved respect. They weren't just fighting Hitler, they were fighting for dignity. They were fighting for a future America hadn't promised them yet. And whether America knew it or not, their service helped build the foundation of the civil rights movement that would follow. Their message was simple: judge us by what we did." After the war, generals and historians studied the Red Ball Express and came to a startling conclusion. It didn't just supply the war, it changed the way wars are fought. The Red Ball Express became a blueprint. Lesson 1, logistics wins wars. Before 1944, armies obsessed over tanks and artillery. After the Red Ball, military planners understood a brutal truth. An army is only as strong as its supply line. This became U.S. military doctrine. Every war plan from that point on, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, started not with battle maps, but with supply routes. Modern warfare became a battle of fuel, food, spare parts, and timing. Lesson 2, keep it simple, keep it running. The CCKW taught engineers something priceless. If a machine can't be repaired in the field, it's useless in combat. Simple beats sophisticated when lives depend on it. Speed of production matters as much as firepower. Nations around the world copied the CCKW's ideas: 6x6 drivetrain, ladder frame, modular parts, field repairability. Even the Soviets studied Lend-Lease CCKWS and used the design principles in trucks like the ZIL series after the war. Lesson 3. Convoys are lifelines. The Red Ball proved that roads can be supply arteries as powerful as any railroad. The idea of prioritized convoy corridors became military standard, still used today in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. Its tactics were copied: one-way supply routes, military police traffic control, priority vehicle status, 24-hour rolling logistics. Modern U.S. Army convoy doctrine traces directly back to the Red Ball. August 25, 1944. Back at Cherbourg Harbor, Sergeant William Henderson wiped the sweat and oil from his hands, tightened one last bolt on a growling CCKW engine, and slapped the side of the hood. The British had called this truck worthless. Experts dismissed it as underpowered scrap metal, but Henderson watched as it rolled forward into formation, one truck among thousands, engines rumbling like distant thunder, heading east toward a war that could not move without it. For 82 days, the Red Ball Express kept the Allied armies alive. It didn't win glory, it didn't win medals. It won the war, not through heroics, but through will, not by design, but by determination. Not with perfection, but with persistence. It was a victory forged by grease-covered mechanics working in rain-soaked fields, by sleep-deprived drivers steering through blackout nights, by men who risked their lives without ever firing a bullet, by African-American soldiers who proved to a divided nation what courage truly looks like. The GMC-CCKW didn't look like a hero. It had no armor, no guns, no glory. But it carried something no other vehicle could: the weight of a nation's hope. The truck the British rejected became America's secret weapon. The convoy no one believed in became history's greatest supply operation. And the men the world tried to overlook proved history can't be written without them. In the end, the power of the Red Ball Express wasn't its trucks, it was its people. People who kept moving when the world was falling apart. People who drove into danger not for fame, but for each other. People who showed that sometimes
The most powerful force in war is simply the refusal to stop.